welcome back, or just welcome if you're new here. I'm Fourie. I'm an employment relations practitioner, and I'm also the owner and director of Fourie Employment Relations. I've included a list of my credentials in the description box below to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. But relevant for today's video is that I have chaired a lot of hearings in my career. I've chaired close to 3,000 hearings. My disclaimer for today's video is my usual disclaimer, and that is that I cover a lot of information in these videos, but I'm not able to cover every exception to the rule or every nuance. Therefore, please contact a professional if you need that. In today's video, I'm going to be covering some procedural fairness aspect of a hearing. Specifically, this video follows on the previous video that I did where I shared how I introduce myself and how I introduce the procedure when I start a disciplinary hearing. I shared the exact wording that I use and why I say that particular speech when I start a hearing. With that video, at the end I said, after I've done my speech, I ask a couple of questions related to procedural fairness, and in today's video, I'm going to be detailing what those questions are. If you haven't yet watched that video, I've linked it in the description box below. Who do I think can derive value from today's video? Most of the value I assume will be going to other employment relations practitioners. Maybe they want to get ideas of how somebody else is doing it, or maybe you're starting out in your career, or maybe you're a student of labor relations, industrial relations, or employment relations, and you want to see how a chairperson does it. Other people who may derive value is managers, HR, payroll, pretty much anybody in a leadership position who's been asked to chair a hearing internally and is feeling maybe a little bit nervous about doing that, or want to gather some information as to some suggestions on how to go about doing that. I also think that this video can be valuable for employees who are faced with a disciplinary inquiry, or trade union officials or trade union representatives, also known as shop stewards. Watching a video like this helps you understand why a chairperson might be asking particular questions, and also to understand more or less what your rights are or what you can expect from a disciplinary hearing. Last thing before we get into the heart of today's video is that I have a website with templates that I think are useful for people in the industry, or for employers, or for employees. One that is relevant to today's video is that on my website, you can find the actual chairperson note form that I use when I chair hearings. It's a form whereby I enter in all the relevant information of the company, the employee, the parties present, and it also includes the questions that I'm going to be covering today and the procedural aspects that I'm going to be talking about today, where you just kind of tick them off as you're going through it. For a small fee, you can purchase my chairperson form that I use when I chair hearings. This form is also helpful in terms of the structure of the hearing, because the layout is typically the steps that you would take in a hearing. Since I've shared my chairperson speech, if it's helpful for some people, sometimes they might add key points that they want to cover in their introduction to that form, just so that you have everything on one document. Right, now that we've covered all that, let's get into the heart of today's video. One of the biggest duties that a chairperson has when chairing a hearing is to ensure procedural fairness. Now, at a bare minimum, that means to comply with the Labor Relations Act, which I'm going to refer to as the Act, and also the further details that are provided in Schedule 8 of the Labor Relations Act, which is the Code of Good Practice on dismissals. Now, I say that which is detailed in the Act, to my mind, is the bare minimum that a chairperson needs to do to ensure procedural fairness. The way that I chair a hearing is not one where it is a fairness tick box exercise. I approach it with a mindset to act out the intention behind the act as well, and to ensure that the person on the receiving end feels like they were treated fairly. Now, you can go through a hearing and you can tick the boxes of fairness, but a person on the receiving end still might not feel like it was fair to them, because that feeling of fairness is quite subjective. And I understand that some people might not think that that is important, subjective feeling of fairness, because when you go to the CCMA or for further adjudication, what is the test going to be? The test is going to be one of objective fairness. So they're going to ask, did you do X? Yes, I did. Okay. Did you do Y? Yes, I did. Okay. Therefore, you meet the requirements of fairness. So then why should we care about subjective fairness when chairing a hearing, or the feeling of fairness that the person gets? Firstly, because I care how people feel, and I care how people are treated when I chair a hearing. But secondly, in a strategic sense of things, if I take 10 to 30 minutes longer when chairing a hearing because I want to slow it down, I want to ensure that the person feels that they're being treated fairly, in almost all cases, if we take that little bit of extra time and effort to ensure that someone feels like they're being treated fairly, they are less likely to appeal against your outcome or the procedure, either internally or to the CCMA or to the bargaining council if the bargaining council has jurisdiction. And I don't have a fear as a chairperson of my cases going for further adjudication at all. But what I am mindful of is when somebody is spending the resources to get me in as a professional chairperson to chair a hearing, that I'm doing it in such a way that it is less likely that more resources then need to be spent after I've chaired the hearing. So the way that I approach it is not with the mindset of, okay, if my case goes to the CCMA, I will have ticked the boxes and I will win the case. The way that I approach it is to treat all people fairly and with respect that are part of the procedure and conduct it in such a way that afterwards there are not unnecessary resources spent on further adjudication. In my experience, which you heard is quite a lot of hearings, where somebody feels that they were treated fairly, even if they don't agree with my outcome, they're much less likely to challenge that. However, often I've seen where somebody is actually treated fairly, but they don't feel that way, they will take the case to the CCMA. And if the fairness requirements were met, that means that that is a little bit of a wasting of resources for the employee, for the employer, and for the CCMA. So just to reiterate, it's not about avoiding the CCMA at all costs. It's for me about not having unnecessary resources spent fighting and having disputes that are unnecessary, where we could take the time to ensure that we are at a bare minimum meeting the fairness requirements of the Act, and then also to treat somebody such that they feel like we are treating them fairly. Now that we've covered that introduction, let's move on to the questions. So in the previous video, I said that this is the speech that I say to introduce myself and the procedure. And when I get to the end, I say to the employee, I'm now going to ask you a few questions. Please say for me yes or no clearly out loud. Now sometimes, and actually in many cases, I do need to reiterate, please say for me yes or no clearly out loud. Because what often happens when I'm asking these questions is that somebody will nod, or they will say something like okay, or they will mumble some kind of gesture. Now I can have assumptions as to what the nod means or the okay means or the mumbling means, but I'd rather not move from my assumptions. I'd rather have a clear yes or no before we proceed, because these are questions I'm asking to ensure procedural fairness of the hearing. So if I encounter a scenario where somebody is saying okay is one that we often receive, and I don't want to interpret okay to mean yes, or they're just nodding or making some kind of gesture, I just say, please say for me yes or no clearly out loud, because I need to have confirmation before I can proceed. Depending on the language ability, I might swap out the word confirmation there for a word that is more commonly understood. Two things to note here. The way that I phrase that when I'm reiterating, please say for me yes or no clearly out loud because I need confirmation in order for us to proceed. Remember that a hearing is usually a high-stress environment. The person is already feeling very defensive, and the more somebody's defenses are up, the more we're going to get a resistance to the procedure. So I use language that is more likely to help that resistance come down. Now, when I say something like, because I need that in order for us to proceed, it helps that the person doesn't hear this as a demand or me as a chairperson trying to control them. I need to conduct the procedure whereby I have parameters and I have boundaries, but I do so with compassion to the people involved. The second thing is where I change my language use, or I might swap out certain words that I know are not as well understood. The reason for that is if we bother speaking, if we are communicating verbally, we're doing so with the intention to be heard and understood. So if I'm using vocabulary that is going to mean that I'm not understood or increase the likelihood of misunderstanding, then I'm defeating the goal of speaking in the first place. I see no point in having an outstandingly complex vocabulary if the people on the receiving end do not understand what I'm saying. Right, now the first question that I pose. Did you understand the procedure that I just explained to you? Now, people are often quite nervous in a hearing. Remember, it's usually high stakes by the time you're getting an external chairperson. So sometimes if I can see that they're feeling nervous, or if I can tell that they are trying to remember exactly word for word what I said in the introduction, I might follow it up with something like, you don't need to remember it. I'm going to take you through it step by step. I'm going to explain to you what to do at every point. I just need confirmation now that you've understood my introduction and, broadly speaking, what we're going to do here today. Again, taking the time to add that extra sentence when I can see that somebody is feeling a little bit stressed just gives them some reassurance that we're going to get an opportunity to go through all of the steps and they don't have to worry about, am I forgetting something there? Was I supposed to remember that at this point that happens? We want them to focus on the facts of the case, where as a chairperson, I will focus on how the procedure goes. And now, while I'm saying this to an employee, this is also usually very important for the manager or the company's representative, because not all of them have been in many hearings, so not all of them know the procedure. So I also typically, at some other point, just reassure them when they ask me, what should I prepare? And I say, prepare the facts of the case. I will take you through the procedure and at what points different things happen. Right, now if I get confirmation that the person has understood the procedure that we're going to follow, I move on to the next question. The next question I ask is, are you ready to proceed? Or I say, can I continue with the hearing? Or I say, can I carry on with the hearing? Those are just variations of the same question to ask, can we move on with the hearing from this point? As in, there's no reason to not have this hearing or that we need to stop here. Most often I'm going to get, yes, you can carry on. If I get, no, you cannot carry on, I'll ask, what do you require? What is preventing us from having this hearing now? And whatever comes up, I address that and I make a decision as to whether we'll be carrying on with the hearing or whether it's necessary to postpone or whether we need to do something before we can continue with the hearing. Variations to how I ask that is usually based on the language ability of the person who is attending the hearing or my judgment of their language ability given the limited interaction we've had up until that point. Question number 3 that I ask is, did you receive a notification to attend the disciplinary inquiry today? Or I say, did you receive a notification to be here today? Usually I have the notification with me or I've seen the notification because before I introduce myself and before I start with the procedure and before I'm doing these questions, I typically ask the manager or the company's representative if I can have the notification to attend the hearing. I use that then to enter the details on the form that I spoke of, the company's details, the manager's details, and it includes the charges and the date that it was issued to them. If you'd like a template for the notification to attend a disciplinary inquiry, I've linked mine in the description box below. Based off of that, if it was completed correctly, I can see when the notification was issued to the employee, if they did sign it. If it was issued to them electronically, I might ask them at what point did they receive it if I don't have proof of when that notification was issued to them. If I see that the notification was issued less than 48 hours prior to the disciplinary inquiry, I might follow up my question with, did you receive a notification to attend the hearing, to ask the person, did you receive sufficient time to prepare for the hearing? Often you'll hear something like, a disciplinary notice must be issued a minimum of 48 hours prior to a disciplinary inquiry. This is not a legislative requirement, as in it's not detailed in the act per se. It's more of a guideline than a strict rule to follow. Yes, in most cases, we want to issue a disciplinary notice 48 hours prior to the hearing, but the most important thing is that the person had sufficient time to prepare for the hearing. So if the person received less than 48 hours notice, I will clearly ask them to confirm, did you receive sufficient time to prepare for today's hearing? And are you comfortable for me to proceed with today's hearing? We often put an emphasis on a minimum of 48 hours, but sometimes 48 hours is not sufficient time. I've done some cases where the company investigated a specific incident for more than 3 months. The person was on a paid suspension for more than 3 months, and then the person was given 1 week to prepare for the hearing, which by the 48 hours rule would be deemed okay. Yet there was more than 100 pieces of evidence that the person needed to work through in order to prepare for the hearing, and it was logs and sort of accounts, really things that you have to sit for long periods of time to go through in order to prepare. So in that case, we still do need to ask whether a week is sufficient time for the person to prepare for the hearing. With that, I just want to caution you, don't always just stick to the rule of minimum of 48 hours, must postpone if it's not 48 hours, because that's not correct. You don't need to necessarily postpone if the person's confirming that they are comfortable to proceed. And also, even if the person has received 48 hours and they're saying to you, listen, I don't feel prepared, I need more time, please can we postpone this? I would recommend that you strongly consider it. Ask them, what do you need more time for? What do you want to look into? And so forth, and make a proper decision on whether to postpone the hearing or not, rather than to say, okay, you've received the 48 hours, therefore I'm not postponing. Or no, you haven't received 48 hours, now I'm definitely postponing. Now, some people might say, no, I don't want to do that. People are going to take advantage of it. They want me to postpone the hearings. In my experience, I don't find a lot of people who unnecessarily want to postpone a hearing. Most people that I encounter that need to sit through a hearing are feeling very nervous at the uncertainty of the outcome and they'd rather just get it done. So the people who are asking for a postponement, that's usually for a good reason. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but I'm saying in most of the cases that I've been asked for a postponement, it was for legitimate reasons where the person was still trying to acquire some piece of crucial evidence. If I'm being asked for a postponement, I give it serious consideration. I usually err on the side of if somebody's asking for a postponement, I'm probably most likely going to postpone it, but I give consideration to at what cost is this coming, especially because if somebody is asking me to postpone it, I'm an external chairperson who does get paid for my services. So the company is incurring already that expense. So I need to weigh up what are the resources being spent on this hearing versus the time that the person needs to acquire something or do something to be more prepared for the hearing. So it's not just, okay, they asked for a postponement, therefore we postpone. We give serious consideration, what do they need that time for? And also at what cost is it coming? Anyway, so I've asked the person, did you receive sufficient notice to attend the hearing? And they'll say yes or no. Yes, we will then continue. No, I will make a ruling on whether to postpone or not to postpone. Next, I will ask the person, do you understand what today's hearing is about? Or I will say, do you understand what we're going to talk about today? This is not included as a separate question on my chairperson form. You can add it in if you'd like it as a separate question. For me, it forms part of checking whether the notice was sufficiently given, because I need to understand whether the person understands the charges that are on that notice. But I phrase it as, do you understand what we're going to talk about today? I don't specifically ask, do you understand the charges on that notification? The reason for that is I found that typically that question leads to the person telling me whether they agree with the charges or not. Now, given most ways that I've asked this question, that can still happen. I've just found that it's a higher likelihood if I ask somebody, do you understand the charges that are on there? And someone will immediately go into a long sentence of like, no, I didn't do it, or various information that we're going to get to. But for now, I need to get through the procedural questions. So in my experience, I found that simply asking, do you know what today's hearing is about? To be one where I can quickly determine whether the person knows and was properly notified of the hearing and what the hearing is about. If it happens that the person starts to speak about the facts of the case and starts to go into a very intense discussion of how they didn't do it, I will very firmly, but with a calm voice, interrupt the person and say, I understand that you want to give me this information. Just for right now, I need to get through the procedural question. So I need a yes or no here. And later in the hearing, I'm going to give you your opportunity to tell me all this information. For now, I just want confirmation. Do you understand what we're going to talk about today? I hear that you don't agree with it, but do you understand what we're going to talk about? Once I have confirmation that they understand what we're going to talk about in the hearing, I move on. The next question is about language use in the hearing. Prior to starting the hearing, even before my introduction, I just check whether the hearing is going to be conducted in English or Afrikaans. Those are the only two languages that I can chair a hearing in. Therefore, by this point, I'm not asking them, do you want me to chair the hearing in English or do you want me to chair the hearing in Afrikaans? Because now I've given that whole speech in a particular language. So what I ask at this point is, I just want to confirm that you are comfortable to proceed in English. Or if I'm chairing in Afrikaans, I will ask in Afrikaans whether they are comfortable for me to proceed in Afrikaans. If a translator has been present from the onset of the hearing, then what I will say here is that I just want to confirm that you are comfortable for me to speak in English, and then I say the person's name that's translating will translate. Typically, the other language that I've mostly experienced in hearings is Xhosa, so I'll say, okay, I just want to confirm that you are comfortable for me to speak in English. The person translator is going to translate into Xhosa for you, and then they're going to translate back into English for me. Now, let's say that I was chairing this in English and we've gotten to this point and suddenly the person goes, no, I'm not comfortable for you to do this hearing in English. I need a translator who's present. I often do receive that the managers or the company representative might feel very frustrated and say, well, why didn't you say this earlier? You should have said it when we issued you the notification, because my notification to attend does specifically ask the person to indicate whether they require a translator or not, because from a practical sense, it just helps us to know upfront, firstly in terms of time, because the hearing does take longer when it needs to be translated, but also to ensure that we have somebody ready who is able to speak both languages. Now, I can really understand the frustration because now we've sort of allotted some time to the hearing and the person saying, listen, no, I need a translator, so now we need to find somebody. What I want to add here though, and this happens a lot, is somebody thinks that they are fine to do the hearing in English. Because that's the other thing that I've heard managers say is, well, this job requires you to speak English, so why can't you speak English in this hearing? But the person will have heard me do the introduction, and you've heard that I do change the language used to try to make it as easily understood as possible. The person will get here and feel very uncomfortable and feel like they cannot go through this and explain themselves properly in a language that is not their first language. So my recommendation here is to have empathy, that it is a very stressful thing for somebody to attend a disciplinary inquiry, and even more so if you don't feel comfortable with the language that you're hearing, or that you need to express yourself in a language where you don't feel entirely comfortable to do so. So although it is a hindrance, if somebody asks for a translator at this point, I will stop the hearing for us to find somebody who can translate. And if there's nobody who's going to be able to translate, I'm likely to postpone the hearing. If a translator is present in hearings, I will also have a follow-up question. And the question that I'm going to ask here is, given that the person heard me explain who I am, the procedure, I've asked several questions, so they've heard my language use at this point. I will ask them and just confirm, does the translator need to translate sentence for sentence, or can I proceed and then you stop me if we need to translate it for you, if there's anything that you've misunderstood or want clarification on, and when you speak, do you want to speak in the language that you are most comfortable with, and then the person can translate that for me. Because just because a translator is present doesn't mean we need to have a sentence by sentence translated if that is not necessary. So most of the time when we have a translator present, it's for the times when the person wants confirmation that they've understood properly, or they want to explain themselves in a language they are more comfortable with. Me asking this question often saves us a lot of time in terms of not doing it sentence by sentence. But if it needs to be done sentence by sentence, then that's what we do. I will say, if you are chairing a hearing where you need to speak sentence by sentence, it does take a lot more concentration because you need to remember what you wanted to say and stop literally after each sentence to ensure that there is not a misunderstanding when it is translated. Now that we've confirmed the language that is going to be used and whether a translator needs to be present or not present, I move on to the final question. The final question I ask is, are you going to be represented by a fellow employee, or are you going to speak for yourself today? And here I just want to say, this is typically the skill set of an employment relations practitioner, is different ways of using language is a crucial part of what we do. So the reason that I phrase it in this way is because if I say something like, do you want a representative to represent you? Often what will happen is the person will think, oh, wow, should I have a representative? Why don't I have a representative? Is she asking me with the intention to have one? Am I going to be disadvantaged if I don't have one? And suddenly we're making the person think that they need a representative where they probably don't. Somebody who needs a representative is going to have a representative, and they probably organize that prior to the hearing. So the way of phrasing it is just such that I'm not encouraging the person to suddenly think, okay, oh no, I need to find a representative. This is not to say I have any issue with a representative being present in hearings whatsoever. Actually, I often appreciate experienced representatives being in the hearing because they will explain things to the employee, and the employee typically trusts them more than they trust the company representative or an external chairperson. So I have no issues at all with representatives being present in a hearing. What I'm trying to get away from here with the way that I'm asking that question is unnecessary representation where the person finds employee that they're probably friends with who has no idea what they're doing there or what they're supposed to be doing there. I'll ask them to participate in the hearing. They'll sort of just sit there and not know what they're supposed to be doing, and they're not adding any value whatsoever to the procedure. But the person felt that they needed to get somebody because of the way that I phrased the question or the way that the chairperson phrased the question. Another thing that often needs clarification here is someone will say, yes, I need so-and-so. And I find that I need to ask, is so-and-so going to be a representative, or are you needing them to tell me about the case, as in, are they a witness? Because often people think that at this point, I'm asking them whether they have a witness or not. Then they'll say, yes, I have this other person who can tell you about the case. So I need to clarify, is this person a representative, or are they a witness? And I will explain the difference between those two, and I will explain to the person that a witness does not come for the entire procedure. We'll call them in to talk about specific facts of the incident that occurred, and they will only be there for that part, where a representative will be present for the entire hearing and they will participate in a different way. The other thing I also have to clarify sometimes is they will point to the translator. And then I also need to clarify the translator is not your representative. I also often need to tell a translator, remember that you are not representing either the company or the employee, because sometimes they do get a bit involved with the case from either side. I do need to remind them sometimes that your role is purely to translate from one language to the other. Because remember, in a disciplinary inquiry, we're unlikely to be using professional translators. Most of the time, we're just using somebody in the company who can speak both languages. They usually have some kind of understanding of the company or the person or the rules of the company and so forth. So part of the chairperson's job is just to make sure that everybody understands what their roles are, and again, with compassion, set those boundaries when necessary. So here, I just clarify to the person, the translator is not your representative. And that is all the questions that I ask in terms of procedural fairness before I move on to actually moving through the facts of the case. After I have clarified these questions, what I will typically move to is to read out the charges or the allegations that are on the notice to attend one by one, and I'll ask the person to say guilty, meaning yes, they did it, or not guilty, meaning no, they didn't do it. If any other questions arise or if any issues come up prior to me starting the hearing or prior to me moving on to the charges, I will address that, and if necessary, I will make a sort of formal ruling if we require that. In terms of other information that I fill in on my form, I also look whether the person was suspended. So I do include information like, have they tried to have this hearing take place prior to this and then it was postponed? Or I will look if the person was suspended and if the suspension was with or without pay. We need to understand these things because these are various elements that a person can challenge in terms of the fairness. So we just need to know what happened before we got there. And usually I can tell what happened before we got there from the documentation that's in front of me. So I complete that on my chairperson form because I chair a lot of hearings and these are my notes that I will refer back to if I get asked any questions about the hearing. Right, so those are the questions that I ask before I move on to the charges. If you would like me to make more videos where I go into detail about how I conduct the rest of the procedure and break up those elements as well, let me know in the comments down below. If you found that this video was helpful, please remember to like it. And if you want to see more of my content, please remember to subscribe to my channel. And just a reminder that I have templates on my website that for a small fee you can purchase. If there's anything that you're looking for that I haven't uploaded just yet, you can send me an email and I probably have a template for it and we can see if I can help you.